You know, it's amazing to me. They are still just figuring out that fathers have some importance in the damn family. This is ridiculous. What's good, y'all? Welcome back to the Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope all is well with you. Y'all know what it is. Getting it in for another day, hoping that something we produce here might be of use to you here at the Onyx Report. Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate if you will. Support the channel so we can keep this going and continue to bring you independently created black male content that does not bend the knee to anybody whose sensibilities are offended when black men open their mouths. Anyway, y'all see the title. Some mental health issues in boys are linked to the absence of their fathers. I always find it interesting when they act like this is a new discovery, when they slowly figure out that fathers have importance, especially when it comes to their boys. It's ridiculous. But anyway, let's get into it. So, as you can see here, this is an article you can find on Center for MalePsychology.com. There it is. Right. Some mental health issues in boys are linked to the absence of their fathers. Right. Dated May 18th. And so it reads, the main reasons the boys were referred to me as psychotherapists were a diagnosis of ADHD with a strap line that nurture had been strongly implicated in causation. B, self-harm, where the referrer had sensed a vaguely seen family issue as part of the causation. And C, predatory sexual behavior recognized as similarly reactive. I discovered that the absence of the father was implicated throughout each of these types of referral. The father's role in so-called conventional families is to support the mother by helping her calibrate her approach to the baby, and throughout infancy and childhood is also to be different, or to be a different parent to the mother, so that the baby/child recognizes difference. This recognition is the beginning of learning that carries on through all situations in life. Now that's going to become a little bit more important as we go on, when you see that the variety of personalities between mother and father provide options for kids, most particularly sons in this instance, right? This recognition is the beginning of learning that carries on through all situations in life. My case notes revealed that the absence of the father had allowed for an overly close relationship between mother and son. Sound familiar? Further, nearly all the children I saw could be said to be underachieving at school because of a disinterest through failure to recognize an inability to learn. Experiencing difference in early infancy acts like a blueprint for apprehending new phenomena through life. By definition, new situations bring difference because they are new and different. Similarly, so too does new information like that constantly available at school. An early appreciation of difference is therefore a strength factor for learning in life and the classroom. Now, see, this is interesting. It's going into more detail about the value of having difference. But in the Black community, the majority of our families are single mother led, right? We end up in a situation where we don't have as much difference when it comes to parental leaders, right? Authority figures in the household, and children therefore are impacted by the lack of difference and imprinted in, if you will, as far as that's concerned, right? So let me see. I want to spend a few minutes outlining the absent father's role in three main referral types mentioned above. In terms of ADHD, the psychosocial and emotional problems of children diagnosed with ADHD are discussed by various authors, for example, regarding how such children find relationships with family, friends, and peers very difficult because they appear to find self-regulation problematic. There may be a lack of regulatory control that children usually have over their minds, emphasizing their difficulties with their executive functioning in the classroom. They cannot calibrate themselves in relation to the tasks they are required to perform. They cannot calibrate themselves. That's interesting. Let's continue. Calibration and regulation is an essential part of the father's role. Bam. Bam. That's incredibly important. Otherwise, you have one parent operating in an unchecked fashion. And this is something that we, dramatically downplay when it comes to the role it plays in rearing children. And that's something we have got to be able to speak to much differently than we tend to. Hold on, I want to make sure I shout the brother out properly. Shout out to Cedric, sent me an interesting post talking about an associate that he's familiar with, a woman who has had a child for a man. I believe she is the sixth baby mama in his list. I think he has over 10 children. And she went into this knowing that he had this dynamic. He had this many kids. And one of the things he and I talked about were the ways in which some women, because it's usually framed in terms of how men manipulate women, but nobody talks about when women walk into these dynamics willingly. And so he was asking me about why this takes place. And one of the things I explained was that, as long as you're only criticizing the father, and, it seems to make sense. And all, fingers point to him. But when you actually take time to look at the women that participate in this dynamic, it opens up a whole new door of observation, meaning you have, and this goes back to my whole analysis on husband sons, right? These are accessible men who can be controlled by women who are often who want to be in positions of authority in a relationship. They want to dictate the terms of the relationship, and that includes reproduction, marriage, so on and so forth. He may not be as desirable in terms of the man she ultimately wants, but he's accessible, he's controllable, and she can deal with him even though he's not her ideal, right? But this article, what it's also pointing to is the impact this has on children, especially in terms of calibration and regulation, right? So what happens when she decides to have a child from a man she knows isn't going to be present? Whether she hits him up for child support on the back end is a whole nother issue. But she knowingly goes into the dynamic simply because she wants to reproduce, and in some instances doesn't want to be bothered with having to negotiate that relationship with a man. I told you guys last year, I had a conversation with my mother, and conversation got so comfortable, she forgot who she was talking to. And when she was talking about young women having kids, she started to kind of pantomime the conversation she would have with young women. And she was doing it with me. And she said, because, she was talking about marriage and children. She said, you may not want to get married. You just may want a child. And you don't want to have to negotiate with that nigga about. And she caught herself. And she said, oh, well, that's, of course, if he abuses you. First of all, abuse had nothing to do with our conversation. That was an out. What we were talking about was young women, reproduction, and their accountability to men in relationships, about how they present themselves, how they carry themselves. What she got caught into when she forgot who she was talking to was what she would normally tell women, which is, he doesn't matter. You may just want to have a child on your own, and you don't want to have to negotiate what happens with that child in relation to that man, because he would have a say in what happens. But the darker side, I shouldn't say darker, but the other side to this dynamic is what this article is pointing out. Without that father presence, you do have issues with calibration and regulation as it relates to the kids. The kids don't learn how to calibrate because they only learn from one parent. And if that parent is somewhat a control, I won't say a control freak, but requires to be in control, especially if she's chosen to reproduce without men intentionally for the purpose of not having to negotiate power in terms of the rearing of those children, calibration can become an issue. So this article is already kind of taking some important turns. Anyway, let's continue. Working individually with the mothers and the boys, I was able to help them begin to recognize and then change their relationship. Speaking for nearly all such cases, one boy said, I can see now that being in class felt so claustrophobic. It was my only space away from mom, and I filled it with the feeling of needing to be free of her. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't organize myself. I was disruptive to others. Wow. This is interesting, right? You're going to see a similar pattern in some of the other areas here. So then you have self-harm, right? The need for escape implied in the previous quotation featured, in all three referral types. Self-harm is usually seen by mental health professionals as a cry to release feelings that cannot be expressed verbally or through other means. This is as true of those who cut themselves as it is for those who poison themselves, often through overdoses. When there is only the mother to confide in, and if and when this relationship is felt to be the cause of the feelings that become unbearable to the young person, then self-harm can provide an escape route for feelings. My work with one young boy ended with him recognizing that I had provided a mental space. This is key. A mental space away from his relationship with his mother. He memorably told me, I release now, or realize, I don't know, I'm tripping today. I realize now that I needed dad to have been at home, giving me a different person like you have to feel things with instead of mom and all her issues. In other words, the father forms another paradigm. And, there's another paradigm that's present that the child can access when, trying to shape their personality. Children try on different personalities like clothes when they're trying to establish who they are. But if they have limited options, that hampers things. Now, in my generation, a lot of what we did, particularly if you talk about black men in the hip hop generation, we eventually turned to other young men, but we also pulled from media. We pulled bits and pieces. The problem with that is you don't get a full dimensional view of another person as a model for what kind of personality you might want to inherit traits from. You just get bits and pieces that are very selectively shown on screen. And that's kind of the thing. As a matter of fact, I have an assignment in my black male class where they have to do what I call a media map, where they have to show me the various maps of images of black men that help frame their understanding of black manhood, right? And it's interesting to watch because you have bits and pieces, and I've done this myself. There's a little bit of Richard Pryor, a little bit of Bill Cosby, there's a little bit of a thousand other media characters that I pulled from, but they are all shards. They're all small little breakages in a mirror that don't allow you the full access to being able to see a person around the clock and get to see how they respond to different stimuli, right? And that's what the value of having parents in the home. But when you eliminate the father, then turn around and blame him for his absence, which we'll get to in a minute, it has an impact on kids that nobody wants to talk about. So this kid here is telling his therapist that at least the therapist provided a new space, but that only lasts as long as the therapy does. And, you can go right back to being frustrated without that constant access. The third type of referral this psychotherapist talks about is the predatory sexual behavior. In no way am I reducing the seriousness of predatory behavior for the perpetrator, and certainly not for the victim, when I say the mother with issues played a very large part in the actions of the boys I saw. While some fathers are violent and eventually leave, or are required by law to leave the family home, it is also the case that some mothers push out nonviolent partners because they do not fit with the historical script of these mothers. Many mothers I saw had serious issues with men. Some had been abused by their own fathers or grandfathers. Having sons prevented them with a problem. Now notice how, he takes this particular interpretation, but there's an absence of what men experience. There's an absence of empathy in some respects to these fathers, but I digress. Having sons presented them with a problem. How were they to live with a man in the house once they had expelled the boy's father, with a male in the house once they had expelled the boy's father, but then lived with their memories of being abused by their own fathers? Some mothers pulled their sons close to them, saying that they were the pride and joy, that they were their pride and joy, whilst in the next breath saying they were just like whoever had abused them, right? And we've seen this in the black community, and it's colloquially talked about even online as, you look just like your damn father. So there's both a love-hate relationship there for a child or son that has nothing to do with his parentage. And so, you have this simultaneous venting of love and hate. Right. And this goes back to calibration and scale in many respects. Without that father's presence, all of that venom and honey thrown at a child at the same time with no scaling, with no check and balance, with no one else in the household that can provide that child relief, means a constant stream of extremes back and forth. Right. And what does that do to a child? Anyway. The claustrophobia released by self-harm for other boys was, for these boys, only released by behaving in the intrusive way that these mothers had been at the receiving end of with their own fathers. So disturbing was the relationship with their mothers, so non-existent were the opportunities to find another escape route, that these boys repeated the offenses already a feature in their families. So in brief, the absence of the father can have profound consequences on both mother and son. There are a great many young boys and, without doubt, young girls with absent fathers who would benefit from an approach to their mental health that takes into account his role and the consequences of his absence. He doesn't talk about why fathers are absent. And usually, the going, notion, especially in the black community, is that fathers are absent because they're trifling, they're deadbeats, especially if they're black. But nobody wants to talk about women having the institutional means to expel him or to make the environment so hostile to him that him leaving on his own looks like his own idea. Men, are constantly assessing risk. They're constantly checking back and forth with sacrifice and risk and measuring what it's worth. And there are many men who have been pushed out of families by women who use the institutional access they had to control the environment without his say. And that way, it provided them plausible deniability when he decides to leave in response to that controlling environment. Because she doesn't have to tell anybody what she did. It's not readily seen. He's not physically assaulted unless he is. But even then, that's not really regarded seriously. So a lot of people in the 70s and 80s, when they started to talk about this deadbeat dad thing in the community, they did not always mention what actually took place and what pushed many men out of the space. And many of those men either went to seek out creating new families or went monk. But nobody talks about why. So we're stuck with the deadbeat narrative, and that's the going interpretation of how men leave families and why, especially in the Black community. But this last sentence of the previous paragraph was interesting to me. So disturbing was the relationship with their mothers, so non-existent were the opportunities to find another escape route, that these boys repeated the offenses already a feature of their families. Notice he didn't talk about boys who were sexually violated within the homes that he's talking about. Teachers, babysitters, even mothers who sexually violate their boys. We're going to continue to act like this doesn't exist, nor are we going to acknowledge the impact it has on these boys themselves. Right? But I couple this particular piece, which is again a reflection on how the absence of fathers impacts boys, and I think there's still a lot to be said here. I think this author dodges accountability a bit when it comes to mother, and I think we do that shit a lot in the academy and in public. We have no problem blaming boys and men, but we really do sidestep full accountability for mothers. And so when you point out that full accountability, you look like you hate women. But really, you're trying to balance something that has been so imbalanced that imbalance is considered normal. To balance it looks like an attack on women, but it's not. And it doesn't have to be. You're just acknowledging something that has not been acknowledged for so long. But it's interesting to watch how people take that as an attack on women. And you have all kinds of people coming out the woodwork to protect women from that amount of accountability. And that's just enough to balance the scale so we can actually look at a situation with some degree of objectivity and clarity with all of the facts. But we've grown comfortable with ignoring men's experiences in these dynamics because it makes women uncomfortable, because it makes feminists uncomfortable, and it holds women accountable for their behavior. Let's look at an accompanying article I want to add to this. This is a piece by Josh Leves. I think that's how you pronounce his name. This is on Newsweek. This came out June 5th, 2020. And he says, they're dragging out the absent Black father's myth again. Can we give it a rest? Right? Now, the reason I'm talking about this article is I found it interesting when you juxtapose the two next to each other, right? First article having to do with the impact on sons when the father is absent. And then in the Black community, this doubling down on the deadbeat father, absent Black father narrative. And what do the two articles or the two issues that the articles refer to really do in the Black community, most especially? Well, usually what it means is that we falsely blame the fathers and we ignore the seriousness of what happens to the boys. And we don't seem to care. And I mean as a society. So he says, as protests fill streets across the U.S., some people looking to deny systemic racism are resurfacing a false, pernicious myth, one that places blame for the biggest problems facing the Black community on Black men. It's the myth that most Black dads are absent from their children's lives. Perhaps most prominently, the focus on allegedly absent Black fathers was proffered up again this week by right-wing PragerU and a video by radio host Larry Elder, who did what so many other people who believe this myth do: conflate marriage statistics and fatherlessness. Right? In writing my book All In, I looked into a wide range of statistics about fatherhood and explored the methodologies behind them to see whether they were presenting an accurate picture. Unfortunately, all sorts of statistics about fathers that are often cited by people across the political spectrum are false. When it comes to Black dads specifically, most in fact live with their children. CDC study found that 2.5 million Black fathers were living with their children, and about 1.7 million were officially living apart from them. Right? So that means obviously there are more fathers living with their children than not. Right? Black fathers. Counting by the number of children rather than the number of fathers presents a different picture. The Census Bureau reports that slightly more than half of Black children live in homes headed by one parent, which is usually, but not always, the mother. This is explained in part by non-co-residential fathers having more children. It's also true that Black children are more likely than others to be born out of wedlock. But neither of these things make children fatherless. Millions of kids live with their fathers half the time, or at least part of the time, through joint custody arrangements. But children generally have one legal address, which is particularly important for purposes of determining school districts. Most often, the legal address is the mother's. This is a major reason that fatherlessness statistics in general are overblown. Fathers' homes are all too often are not counted officially as being homes with children. Also, some unmarried couples live together, making the marriage statistics even more misleading. Meanwhile, among fathers who live with their children, Black dads are in many ways the most involved in their kids' lives. Black fathers, 70%, were more likely to have bathed, dressed, diapered, or helped their children use the toilet every day, compared with 60% of white and 45% of Hispanic fathers, the CDC study found. Also, more Black fathers than white fathers took their children to or from activities every day and helped their kids with homework every day. The lead researcher told me this study marked the debunking of the Black fathers being absent myth. Fatherlessness can mean different things to different people. At what point is a child fatherless? Seeing dad only once a month? Never. Some kids who live with their fathers sometimes feel fatherless. Still, given that many kids who live separately from their fathers don't see them, or at least don't see them often, statistically, fatherlessness is more common among African American families than among others. But that brings us to a second problem with trying to bring up fatherlessness now amid protests. Broken families are an inevitable consequence of the exact kinds of problems protesters are currently standing up against. Innocent Black men who are killed by police obviously won't be there for their families. If you care about Black children being fatherless, you should be supporting the protesters. And he goes on in regard to George Floyd. Black people are also more likely to be charged, tried, convicted, and sent to jail for all sorts of crimes than whites, which again pulls fathers away from their children. And even in the prison complex, people are striving to be there for their children, even from behind bars. While writing All In, I spent time in prison interviewing men who were enrolled in a fatherhood program. So this particular piece attempts to debunk some of the statistics around fatherlessness and what that actually looks like. And yet again reaffirms that Black men have a presence that, again, is downplayed and disregarded. But again, when accompanying this with the other article, we can see that the impact mainly falls to boys. And how much of that we care about is a whole nother matter. Either way, hopefully this information was useful. Curious to hear your thoughts about it. Hit me up in the comments. Appreciate your support. Hope you guys have a good one. Peace.